So I'll go ahead and get started. Okay. I expected a small crowd and a small room, so we'll go with this. I'm John Piles. I am presenting or running this roundtable. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Human Neuroscience at University of Washington. I run the center there. The second center I've run, I am also the chair of the safety committee. I've done MRSO training, and then I was also on the full board of the IRB at Carnegie Mellon for 5 years. So this stuff is of interest to me just because I think it's interesting. I think protecting our participants is interesting and very important, but also because it's important for me as someone who runs a center to cover these kind of topics and think about this kind of stuff a lot. So who here? I mean, we have like 10 people, so anyone who wants to like say why they're here. I think we already have a neurologist in the room, which is interesting, and then you run a center or what? Oh, okay, so we have someone that's cognitive neuroscientist, but is in a core facility, so that's great. Anyone else want to say why they're here? No, I realize we're putting you on the spot. Okay. All right, so what are we going to do? I have no disclosures. Why are we doing this? So, I want to kind of start to bring attention to this as it's a critical part of MRI research, and we in research have different challenges than they do in a clinical situation. Start to open a discussion. This hasn't been a topic that's really been talked about at HBM, even though this is kind of the conference for MRI research with non-patient populations and patient populations, but probably this is the place you're going to find the highest concentration of people doing work with non-patient populations in a non-clinical setting. We've done pretty well so far, meaning that I haven't heard of anyone dying, which is really good, in the scanner and a research scanner. I don't think anyone has, well, actually, no, I take that back. In North America, no one has died in the last 21 years, I believe, in an MRI accident, which is great. There have been some injuries, but I personally, and actually I'd be interested if anyone here knows of any close calls that have been associated with research. So given the challenges I'm going to outline, we've actually been doing pretty well. So we should kind of share what's been working well and find a way to start doing that. But then also we should kind of talk about the issues that we have at research centers and start asking some questions about the kind of the challenges we face that are different from people in a clinical setting. And then sharing is useful because it reduces the burden potentially on centers and people who run centers and even researchers. If you have information out there that you can have as a resource, that makes it easier for you to safely conduct your studies without having to worry so much about the stuff me, are going to talk about today. And then the last part is to kind of see if there's any feedback in the room to how we can share and improve kind of the sharing of this information. So that might be a best practices document. I'm also on the best practices committee at HBM. Wiki, read the doc, something online, resources, whatever. The current time, I found out how to do this by experience, by scanning for 20 years, and by reading a lot of other sites' web pages. And maybe we can do better than have everyone go around every single center or the centers they've worked at or think are good and figure out the resources from there. Okay. So here's the agenda, but we can toss this out too, depending on what people want to talk about, but everyone's a little bit quiet. That's fine. Anyone else has questions or wants to bring something up as we move along, totally just raise your hand, and there's a couple microphones if you can hear. Yeah. Go to Mike. I'll give you Mike. And if you do want to slip out at some point, I won't hold it against you. It's fine. I sit in the back too.
The thing that I wanted to put on the table is that we want to be safe, but we also shouldn't let safety limit things by being too safe.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things, so I work in a center where we have clinical scans and we also have research scans. And I have patients who regularly have clinical scans, but when I want to then bring them for research scans, I'm often not able to. And it's the sorts of issues are hip and knee replacements, and
Oh, really?
historical cesarean sections, appendectomies, and to not be able to scan patients for those reasons when they're frequently having clinical scans. So I'm not worried they're going to die on the table. What's happening is I'm not able to access a clinical population for research.
That's really interesting. Okay, so
why I'm
maybe
here.
let's come back to that, because you've, I think, identified a couple different things. One is, I think, differences in countries, which is going to be a big issue in these topics. So where are you located? At UCL. Okay, so all the things you just mentioned, for us, we wouldn't care at my center. So, but right. So I don't know. I mean, again, this is part of the issue is that there's wide variability, apparently, between countries, sites, whatever, about how we kind of deal with these issues. So maybe I'll run through this. I think it'll take like 15 minutes, and then we can kind of come back to things. Okay. So what do I have? So first of all, I feel like the big issue is the difference between clinical and a research setting. So in a clinical MRI, and again down here I have the big caveat. This all varies wildly, and I'm in the United States, and I have actually never worked in a hospital because I'm not an MD, I'm a PhD. So I know a decent amount about clinical scanning, but I've never sat in a radiology department and scanned with them. So what I know is secondhand there. So I'm interested in information about that. But in a clinical MRI, we usually are in a hospital setting, right? And we have available support for one thing. So there's usually a code team if there were to be cardiac arrest or some kind of other medical emergency. There's supervision of scanning and safety oversight by a radiologist. At least in the US, that's how it works, is that everyone who's in that center is basically the radiologist. The buck stops with that person, right? So in the US, at least, the MRI technologist takes their orders from the radiologist, and the radiologist is the one who signs off on safety in the end in a clinical scan. And I think that's different. UK person, radiographers are different than technologists in the UK. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think radiographers have more responsibility and more training usually than a MRI technologist does, at least in the United States and maybe in Canada and North America as well. They, at least MRI technologists, licensed MRI technologists in the United States will not stick their neck out for much. And it's really because the buck stops with the radiologist. So any questions that they have about safety, they're just going to go to the radiologist, and it's there. Whereas I think radiographers have more oversight there, which is an interesting difference. Usually in clinical scanning, you're going to be scanning with the product sequences, right? And FDA approved in the US or whatever you have in your country of interest. So you're not going to be doing the WIP sequences, C2Ps, that basically is the only thing that I scan right now at my research center. And there's additional screening mechanisms available, right? So you have access to medical records that oftentimes we don't have when we're doing research scanning, and you have X-ray. So if you have any ambiguity about someone, especially in certain populations, we're like, yeah, I don't really remember if they left the leads in with a pacemaker or not, or yeah, I don't really remember what shrapnel was left in me from when I was, a veteran or whatever. You can just do a CT scan or an X-ray and get that information. That's almost never available in a research setting, unless that research setting is part of a larger clinical setting or you have special arrangements made for your study. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, because it's invasive. And or, yeah, that's a great point. So everyone didn't hear, excellent point that even if you had it, like if you're scanning in a hospital or research center in a hospital and it's there, you probably can't use it because it might not be part of your IB protocol. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that happens all the time. Yep. And the last big one, which we'll come back to, is that the scanning is clinically necessary and to the benefit of the patient when we're in a clinical setting, right? Clinical setting is also kind of ahead of us in terms of organization and certification and that kind of stuff, although not that far ahead. This is actually pretty new, which I found somewhat shocking considering MRI has been around in a clinical setting for what, almost 40 years now in some form, definitely wide use for 30 years. But I think the first ACR manual and MRI safety, I believe, came out in 2013, and the revision just came out this year in 2024, so the draft revision. So it's only been about 10 years where even the clinicians have really written this down in a more rigorous way. And the same goes for the clinical credentials, which are now trying to be pushed in wider use, but if you talk to clinical folks, that's not even necessarily the case either. So the American Board of Magnetic Resonance Safety, and again, I'd be very interested to know if there are international bodies or other countries that have similar organizations, pretty new. I think they're less than 10 years old, something like that. And their certifications are also pretty new. So their certifications are Magnetic Resonance Medical Director or Physician. So that's the MRMD. That's basically the person that is supposedly kind of at that facility or at that radiology department in charge of safety, and they're the ones with the medical license. Then there's the MRSO. That's what a lot of technologists, at least in the United States, are getting that certification, which is a Magnetic Resonance Safety Officer. They're kind of the day-to-day on-the-ground person in the scanning department who has that kind of extra safety training. And then finally, there's been Magnetic Resonance Safety Expert, who's usually a physicist, sometimes someone with other expertise that they've picked up along the ways, and they're kind of the consultant, okay? Oh, they have? Okay. Things I don't know, that's great. So ACR does require that? Oh, okay. That's good. I didn't actually know that, so that's good to know. I thought these were newer than that, but maybe not. Okay. Yeah. Cool. That's interesting. So the ABMRS, whatever, I think it's Ellie Canal, you probably know, from Pittsburgh, who teaches a lot of the MRI safety courses. And then I don't know if Shellick was involved in this too, and a couple other people. And it's a very good idea, and it's gotten technologists a lot more interested. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yep. That's interesting. So you harmonize yours with the clinical? Okay, so that's interesting. So we'll, in a minute, talk about why actually I don't like that idea personally, and I think there's some problems with it. But yeah, but that's great. Yeah.
Actually, one question, because indeed we have the credentials. So in Germany, we also have quite strict guidelines regarding a lot of things. I recently understood one of the guidelines is also we need like a safety officer,
Mm-hmm.
which has to be specifically assigned. But there's actually no description of what qualifies a safety officer.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So it says you need a safety officer which has any form of credential. What the shape of this credential is completely open.
That's
So,
interesting.
Which is simply awkward.
Is everyone able to hear, kind of? Okay. Okay. So speak up. We can't toss the microphones around, but I
So
feel
like
like.
I work in Germany, and we also have strict rules, and we need also a MRI safety officer. However, what is missing is an explanation of what qualifies a MRI safety officer. So we then have a person who kind of assigned, but he has no specific, he's not an MRI physicist, he's not a medical doctor,
So that's interesting. So these are certifications from their exams. So basically take an exam. And you'll hear, if you talk to MRI techs in the US, everyone, or not everyone, but lots of people are studying for the MRSO exam. So I think one of the main points of the ABMRS, which I never remember how to say, is to provide some kind of actual credentialing in the form of 3 different exams that are these 3 different certifications. So, but that's interesting that in Germany that doesn't really exist. You just pick someone. Okay. What else do I got? So, in contrast, what you guys probably already know, so in research centers, we're often a standalone facility. Not always, but like my facility is standalone, and we're not in clinical departments at all. So I'm in a psychology department in the basement of a psychology building, and the hierarchy above me is College of Arts and Sciences, so no one with any kind of clinical relevance at all. And that's, I don't know the numbers, I keep track of about 50 to 80 different centers that are research dedicated. I would say probably at least half, if not 2/3, are in that situation, and maybe a third are actually located inside hospitals. Staffing is usually minimal, right? So my staff consists of me, Dr. Kelly Chang is here taking notes, and a couple MRI operators, which we'll talk about, and that's it. So it's really mostly Kelly and I who run the center, as opposed to a radiology department where you might have, I don't know, 10, 15 people between technologists and physicists and whoever else. We're not regulated in the same way, right? So in the hospital, the regulation is potentially by the FDA, by governing bodies and whatnot. The regulation is actually very ambiguous, at least in my experience with research MRI centers. It's mostly if we have an issue, we're answering to the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, at our center. That's who's kind of looking over our shoulder, and ourselves, because we don't want to hurt anybody. So it's a different arrangement than in a clinical setting for sure. Safety training is often internal. So the safety training is a decision and kind of up to whoever's running the center. So I run my own safety training, basically in the way that I've collected it from other places. It's not standardized in any way. And the last thing, which we'll come back to in a second, is the big one, which is scanning is of no benefit to the participant, which just changes the entire risk assessment that we're talking about here. Okay, so just to dive into that a little bit more, and this is an important thing, and this is where, at least when I talk to clinicians oftentimes, and even when I talk to the consulting radiologists who do my incidental findings, there's a little bit of a disconnect here that these are not patients, they are participants, and there is a big difference. There is 0 benefit to being scanned, right? The only benefit they're getting is whatever cash payment or picture your brain or whatever the IRB has approved that you get to give to your subjects. They have otherwise 0 benefit. So that means safety is paramount, right? Because if you're in a clinical setting, there is a cost-benefit trade-off, right? There's a different level of risk tolerance. So it's a very different level of risk tolerance in a research setting than there is in a clinical setting. And trying to figure out where to draw that line is, I feel like, one of the biggest challenges that we have. Because things that they will do all the time across the street at the hospital, I will never do, right? I will never scan a pacemaker, no way, no how, at my center, even though pacemakers are put in pacing, MR mode all the time across the street, and they scan them constantly. Like, it's just not going to happen. That risk assessment is a no. And basically, same thing goes with any electronic medical device. That's a no. In contrast, across the street in the hospital, sure, they'll figure that out. They'll do it because that patient might really need that scan. So that's like one of the big kind of overriding things, trying to figure out, at least in policies of screening and stuff like that, with our participants. Then the other couple things we need to think about, which we'll come back to, and this is regardless of screening actually, is participant comfort and participant privacy, right? If you're in the hospital, like a lot of your privacy just goes totally out the window, right? And your medical records, any MD nurse can usually pull them up, or at least that's the way in the US. They're not supposed to, right? Yeah, sure. But I mean, anyone on your team, right, has them. If you're their patient, then their chart should be available, I think. That's correct? Right. Okay, but if that person's a part of your care team. Yeah. Whereas in a research setting, it's more like if you you don't need to know. And that even goes to things like screening questions, right? And when we get to it in a second, a lot of research centers where we're operating with MRI operators who are not technologists, but are oftentimes colleagues, so graduate students, postdocs, and might know the participants, because most people here know at HBM that a lot of scanning goes on that's within lab, right? And there might be medical procedures that someone has had that they're asked to disclose to make sure they're safe to go in the magnet that they might not be super thrilled with sharing with the postdoc in the lab. I mean, absolutely they can choose not to be a participant in the study, but that's something, again, that we have to think about in research that is not even an issue in a clinical setting, right? Same thing with comfort and privacy, and this goes to like changing clothes and stuff like that. Clinical setting, they don't care. You're putting on scrubs no matter what, right? Whereas in a research setting, depending on the study, like that can be a big deal. And other things about comfort and the invasiveness of the questions asked, especially if you're dealing with a special population. Like you could be doing scanning with body dysmorphic disorder, and that asking those questions or asking someone to change clothes actually is a big thing and something the IRB might even get involved with, whereas in a clinical setting, that's never going to come up, right? Yeah. Yep.
So they are very motivated to take part. They want to disclose stuff. So they, although it's not, the scan is not for their direct benefit, they're very motivated to be part of it.
Yep.
So I think that's one thing to add. But the other thing is, I don't know if you're going to talk about incidental findings, because I think
Yeah.
there's, okay,
Yeah, we'll get to that.
So there's quite a difference as well.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's see, what else do I got here? All right, so here are the topics that I think are kind of different between, or my list of what's stuff that we would need to figure out. Like if we tried to do a best practices document or we tried to start putting something together in a wiki, that this is the list of stuff that I've come up with off the top of my head that I think is important to consider, and very interested in other topics that I might have missed here. Should I have like run through this like for 10 minutes real quick, and then maybe we just kind of open it up for discussion after? Okay, so I'm gonna run through kind of some details, which I think are issues here, and then we can come back to whatever you guys want to come back to and talk for another 20 minutes or whatever. Okay, so safety organization and oversight, right? This is a big difference that we don't really have. How is that done? Should there be some standards? Should we think about that as a research community, putting in place or recommending what the setup would be? That seems like a logical thing, that there should be at least a safety committee. An MRRD is something that ACR has mentioned. It's basically, if you're not at a clinical facility or a research site, then instead of an MRMD, it's an MR research director. So they're kind of filling the same role as MRMD, but they're the kind of research director. So at my site, that would be me. What's the role of the IRB in this? Usually, in my experience at least, they're the ones that are kind of providing the oversight. And in my experience as well, and again, be interested to hear when we kind of open up for discussion, they oftentimes don't have the expertise on their IRB. And that depends on the size of your institution and who's there and who happens to rotate through. But part of the reason I was on the full board of the IRB at Carnegie Mellon for 5 years is that myself and a biomedical engineer were kind of the human subjects imaging people. And we would always look at any protocol that came through that did MRI, FNIRS, TMS, whatever, that was like in our wheelhouse. But not all IRBs have that. And that can be a problem. Like I've seen protocols approved by the IRB that are, in my opinion, not safe to scan. And then what do you do? Which is an interesting question, so we can come back to that. Yeah, or do you want to? Yeah. Absolutely, and procedures too. So I mean, what I've kind of up with to try to deal with part of this issue, it's at my center and then my previous center, we would essentially, as part of our project registration process, you needed to submit your IRB documents to the center, and then me as the research director and then potentially the safety committee, if I wanted extra opinions, would review that essentially for safety. And at least at Carnegie Mellon, what that ended up being is the IRB is like, oh, great, you guys will do the safety stuff. You will then tell us if it's okay with you, because that's where it's being scanned, and then we'll review all the other stuff. But that procedure, I think, is very uncommon and not something that IRBs actually think about much. And it's not a great situation, in my opinion. And I'm actually a little surprised that more problems have not come up over the 20 years that we've been doing a lot of research scanning with kind of interaction between centers and IRBs in terms of expertise and what's safe and what's not and who knows what about what. So, yeah. Yeah, stuff like that, exactly, right. So things, yeah, because they don't have the expertise, they're reviewing it. Right, stimulus device, the one I had that was approved was, they approved scanning with basically no kind of restrictions. They were brain scanning a mother with a newborn infant on her stomach to do basically kind of social, whatever, receptive resting state stuff, and that just sailed right through. They didn't even bat an eye. And I'm like, there's all kinds of issues I have with that, with SAR, with getting pinched in the table with a little finger. You know, there's a lot of things in terms procedurally that would need to be done, and that just went right through, you know.
And maybe so also in those there we utilize the IRB. What I noticed is this nice disclaimer that any ruling they give is professionally and advice. So they also refuse to have the accountability of
Is that the way it is in Germany? Technically, it's advice. Yeah.
that's something what they don't understand. And so I think this is also a general problem. Like we want an official document, an official guidelines, so we have something to fall back on. If something happens, we say now, yeah, we follow all guidelines.
Yep.
But at the moment, we are blaming our own guidelines.
Yep. This is part of the reason, yeah, we're here, I guess. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's just some of the issues I think that are here. This could be a whole multi-hour thing on its own. The whole technologist versus MR operator, or radiographer versus MR operator thing. So at least in, well, both in the US and of the international sites or places that I kind of track, I would say maybe it's about 50-50, where scanning is either done by a licensed MRI technologist, a professional, that's what they do, or a radiographer, versus having what's called an MR operator, which I'm terming as someone who's basically trained to run the scanner that's usually a researcher. So they are doing this for their own research or whatever, but they are not that's not their career as MR technologists. And this actually has been considered by ISMRM. This was back in 2015, and they put out some guidance for the recommended minimum training for these folks. But it's pretty sparse, it's not super detailed, and you know, this is again something that varies widely between centers. So our center uses a mix of professional technologists and MR operators that go through a training program, but I've designed that training program based on talking to colleagues and advice and my own personal experience. It's not really, hasn't been set or even recommended by anyone. And this is not, you know, this document, kind of says what they think you should know-ish in a very broad way, but says nothing about kind of recommended experience hours or things like that. So this is another, and I know it varies widely. So some places who may or remain nameless, like you do a couple hours, you shadow a couple scans, and then they just throw you in, and those grad students are running scans. And that is not that, it's more common than you think. I know that would freak some people out. Other places you're doing 20, 30, 40 hours of essentially shadowing and then have to run a complete scan and has a very high bar to be able to be an operator. So again, wide variability here in research sites and how this is done. And in some ways, I'm a little surprised that it has gone, quote unquote, so well. People say well, but there haven't been more issues with this over the last 25 years of scanning. Same thing kind of with safety training, right? So what are the standards for researchers and operators safety training at research sites? Almost all of that is in-house. So yeah, there are some videos out there. So Frank Shellick and definitely different resources on the web. The manufacturers have safety videos, but a safety video is not a safety training, in my opinion. And how that safety training is done, again, there's wide variability in that site to site. Some people will, or some places will. It's like you watch an hour video and you're good to go. I do a 3-hour in-person safety training that I insist is in person, followed by a site tour, and that's basically just to qualify you to sit there and push the buttons on the computer and help the MRI operator in an emergency. But that is not standardized in any way, and there's no kind of currently list of content that is out there that's even recommended for what should be in there that I'm aware of. So I see that as a kind of a problem as well. So, and there is a question, should this be standardized or customized? Because different sites have different rules in different countries and even different organizations, if you're in a hospital, if you're outside a hospital, whatever. So there's a lot of variability there. So even if we thought about trying to standardize this, there would have to be allowances for how that would be dealt with. And then I think another thing that's kind of not been talked about at all, which I've just started at my center, is safety kind of culture training, I would say it. In a clinical setting, this is usually kind of obvious. There's a radiologist, and there's a radiographer or technologist, and RNs, and you know kind of who the buck stops with, and people know the hierarchy or who answers to what and who's allowed to do what. That's a little bit less clear oftentimes in research settings. And oftentimes also, the researchers that are there and expected to be helping in a potential emergency situation in a facility that is independent from a clinical setting and potentially not staffed, so in a basement of a psychology building somewhere at 10 o'clock at night with like 2 people there, one of those persons is a grad student or an undergrad or a post-bac RA who's 22 years old, and how much have they been trained? So at least at my site, I try to kind of do a little bit of overall safety culture training, which is crew resource management, which some people might be familiar with in aviation and in emergency settings, to kind of explain what overall safety culture is and best practices are in safety, and just get people who are there and might have to do something and have that responsibility, start thinking about that. Like start thinking about how they help, what their role is, how to keep people safe, that kind of thing. And I don't think that's covered much either at the moment. Screening, this is a big one. So clinical versus research screening. One of the big things that is an issue here is the differences that occur in clinical versus research settings, and especially with regard to participant privacy. There has been discussion, most of you probably know there's an enormous MRI safety group on Facebook. So it's like 30,000 people. That's actually probably the biggest online forum for MRI technologists to talk to each other about safety issues. It's run by Ellie Knoll, and Frank Shellick is on there a lot too, a couple other people. But given, at least in the United States, and this could be in other countries as well, there is now an issue about asking certain questions and whether the safety screening that you're collecting as part of research, is that a medical record? Who has that? Who has a copy of it? Does it get destroyed after? Those kinds of things. And this is especially with regard to pregnancy, at least in the United States, and this is kind of an issue for us and very dependent on, again, on what state you're in. So other countries, maybe you don't have to worry about this, good for you. But in the US, this is a problem. So in terms of research sites, we are moving towards figuring out, should we even still be asking this given the risk, right? So the risk mitigation for pregnancy, very low in most of our opinions. Like prenatal scans are done all the time in a clinical setting at this point. And the big study from Canada showed that there's very, very low risk. So now, again, clinical, they're not gonna care. But as a research site, we have to balance, should we even be asking that question and collecting that data, because that data might potentially be a risk to our participants in other ways versus the actual safety risk that's provided in the MRI scan. And I know some sites have gone to, instead of asking the question, to going to an assent or an acknowledgement of risk as opposed to a direct question. So instead of saying, are you pregnant? They say, there, over the last 25 years, has been no known, risk associated with being scanned while you're pregnant, but there is, out of over a month of caution, you may choose to not participate in the scan. Do you acknowledge that? Initial here, or sign here, okay. Same thing with surgeries and other medical procedures, and also and pre-screening. So for example, here is the ACR form, kind of the first bit of it. And this is an example of the form that I use at my center. And again, as was pointed out, there's no standardization here. Most people do different things, and this, again, varies country to country. But this section here, in particular, that's on the ACR form, I have big problems with for research, right? Because A, it's private information that I don't feel like I need to know for research scanning. Like, breastfeeding is relevant for contrast. I don't do contrast at my center. Possibility that you're pregnant, that is a very loaded question, right? Possible, what does that mean? And you can get in a long discussion with that. Yeah. Interesting. So who was unhappy with that? Your IRB or? That's interesting. Okay. And yeah. So this is exactly, and I'll point out too that this is actually where I bumped into historically, less now, but absolutely 5 years ago, absolutely 10 years ago, when we already had plenty of knowledge about pregnancy, that even at 3T, this is not a big issue, that IRBs, because some of the people sitting on the IRBs had locked in their brain the status of MRI in 1995, that they would require a pregnancy test. And that, again, is an invasive, uncomfortable potential thing for participants, and from a safety standpoint, at least in my opinion, and everyone I've worked with, absolutely not necessary for 3D scanning. Date of last period is another one. So like on our form, and on I know many forums, any gendered or sex questions we've just like gotten rid of. And that's actually something, again, difference in a clinical setting. Like we don't even ask male or female anymore at our center, because from my opinion, safety standpoint, and actually I'd be very interested to know if I'm missing something, I don't know of anything where it matters. So we don't ask, we actually don't put in our DICOM data either for anonymization. And I think that's an important discussion to have, because there's just differences in terms of risk and privacy in a research setting versus a clinical setting. We can happily come back to this at the end if you want. Yeah. Sorry? Excellent. Thank you for bringing that up. So SAR calculation, yes. And again, if there's MR physicists in the room, I'd be very interested to know. You will remember that on the scanner, they do ask male, female, or on a Siemens, they ask male, female, or other. And I deep dove into this. I run a board called Snug Discuss, which is with Ben Inglis, which is really about Siemens technical questions. And this came up. The answer, at least with Siemens, is there is a difference. The difference would never SAR someone out based on that choice, because that wouldn't really make sense. That you have a gender difference be the difference between someone SARing out on a scan or not SARing out on a scan, at least in normal operating mode. And other is the most conservative, at least on a Siemens magnet. I really would be curious to know if anyone knows Philips, GE, or United Imaging, if that's the same case. But we are comfortable with clicking other because it's actually more conservative than male or female. But the yeah. Yeah, do you have a comment on that? Right. Exactly. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so for anyone who didn't hear, right, there's SAR models that are based on that setting. At least my understanding from what I've been told from the Siemens engineers is that in Siemens, basically they divide the body into 5 regions and they distribute the mass that you put in. So when you put in height and weight, they're taking that mass and they're distributing it, and that is based on, at least in a Siemens magnet, on a lookup table. So they have a demographic lookup table that is based on population data that takes the age and the sex of the participant into account and then says how those 5 different cubes or volumes distribute the mass and then do the SAR calculation based on that. So they're distributed differently between male and female. And just like you said, if you do other, it's basically more conservative overall.
I have a Siemens Tesla scanner here. Basically, you can't scan anybody in the buildings
Yeah,
because they don't trust the model. They have to post the model.
that's
It's
really,
not because it's not safe.
yeah,
It's because they don't have the necessary model.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting. So I'm really glad you brought that up too. I haven't even put in here because there's so much other stuff. Difference between 3T and 7T, right? Because 7T is a whole other ballgame that I think there's even different stuff that we would have to consider if we were talking about trying to do best practices documents or trying to figure this stuff out. That, yes, exactly. And I think I agree with it still at 7T, or definitely at 11.7T. Anyone here from that scanning center in France? No, but they, that 11.7T or the 10T at Minnesota, yeah, I would ask about pregnancy there and potentially be a difference. Yeah.
One of the other challenges around standardization is field training. You could split it into, here's a standardization of 3T, 7T. The other complication is trying to make a form that fits every study. So not all studies are just head.
Yep.
So then, your tattoo, again, in places have different rules around where your tattoo is placed relative to where you're scanning, what part of the body. So again, all of those things get wrapped up. I'm not saying these are reasons we shouldn't standardize these things, but it presents a challenge when you're trying to fit everything into one thing and then being like, well, does that question actually matter for my study?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that we should talk about this at the end, that standardization is probably almost impossible on some level to really be standard. But I think that maybe what we can think about is giving people decision trees or decision mechanisms or training, and this is kind of like the canal training does this a little bit, to how to think through the safety considerations of the scenario that we're trying to deal with. And that would be the guidance, and to make sure that researchers and centers have that knowledge so that they can make an informed decision, not necessarily have it set in stone that thou shalt not scan tattoos with a knee coil at 3T, because you never know. If, yeah. We'll run through the rest of this. Okay, so screening, implant evaluation is another big thing in research. So how is that done if you don't have a radiologist? So a lot of times radiologists that are contracted through centers like my center, they're an incidental finding radiologist. They're not a consulting safety radiologist. Yeah, you had a question? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's all kinds of things like that. Exactly. So
Do you have a list then of implants? So
who would approve it? This is
so
the problem. Yeah.
So in our department, I think sounds like we're conservative on all of these measures. And
Yeah.
there's a physics department that meets regularly with sort of safety committee that makes a list of implants that they will approve at 3T and 7T. Very much
Yeah, we'll stand here so you can talk towards
veering
these.
towards the
Yeah.
conservative. And this is one of the problems that I see is that we're not being allowed to. If I want to scan someone with a hip implant, I have to provide notes and of course notes for hip implants so I know what device it is. And then if they've had any sort of abdominal surgery, I'm doing head imaging, any sort of abdominal surgery, I need notes and X-rays. And actually, it's trying to get notes from someone who's had an appendectomy, maybe
50 years
some
ago,
of
yeah.
their 70s patients, it might be 50 years ago,
Yeah.
or a cesarean section, means that I effectively can't scan that patient. And it's just, where do we get that data to show that it's likely is safe to scan someone in a head clamp if they've had because actually most of the unlikely to have lips, if they do have lips, they're going to be fibrosed. But I would really like if people here have guidelines that they use.
Yeah, let's come back to that, and it sounds like you have the expertise if you actually do safety certifications.
And if you're not, if you have a metallic component that's away from the area that you see, you worry about rate switching the stack.
Yeah.
And surgical clips that might be left require surgery and rate switching.
At 7 Tesla as well.
Yes, it is. And I've done the clips that for a long time they're contraindicated. I mean, it turns out that even if you read the post-op notes, they don't write down. I mean, you talk to a surgeon, they use clips all the time, they don't write it down.
I know. So you can't get this information.
You don't need to worry about it as long as you're not scanning in that area. So you don't.
Is there something I can take to my physicist like do you have that some sort of guidance, because they're worried, they're saying, well, I can't approve this because there's no data about this, so how, or there's just, it's not written anywhere, but if this is what's being done in 7
Calculate what the current will be generated from gradient switching.
Yeah.
So the max of gradient switching is basically the dimension of your gradient pool.
yeah
Gradient switching, it's 0 in the middle, but it's the maximum that they have in the gradient pool. You can calculate what the current field will be in surgical time.
Can I get that written down somehow? I
Yeah,
mean,
we should talk offline, but yeah.
Just clarifying that point.
Yeah.
You know, I've often come into these things and effectively get the response of, you know, yes, that was approved for clinical imaging. However, because we've got WIPs and C2Ps, unclear. So if we're doing on the basis of the hardware of how fast our gradient could switch, is that how you're doing it? Is you're saying, like, look, even if we had a WIP, our gradient can only go this fast. So
You have the maximum slew rate.
Yes.
Gradient.
Yeah, you have a C pushed it. This is the max that you allow. Okay. I mean,
We have a ceiling now.
I think what you're coming up against in lab as well is often you know, you've got documentation on conditional devices, but or 3T, and then essentially, if you, the way you're doing things, triple service. It's the max. So
But if anything's near the RF, I know, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So basically, there's a couple of, you know, I kind of really should like CMR, and other places. We actually share our safety guidelines. We have certain questions that come up with our SLT. We need to ask for you guys to do it. So pretty much everybody, if you're scanning the head, any prior surgery or anything, you know, those shoulders,
yeah,
if you're using an open
that's fine.
but,
Yeah.
but away from that, you know, away from the shows, you're kind of in the scanning. Like, if you would scan something in a prisoner, go ahead and scan it. As long as you're not afraid of static field issues. The static field, you know, if you have a fresh implant, somebody's got a brand new implant, forces an unsaturated, you know, metallic implant at 7 Tesla 20 times, particularly like the highest EPS on the radar, which they might get exposed to.
So that's but that only applies for recent implants. How recent is that?
After like, you know, 6 months or so.
Okay.
Let me get through.
So, I mean, my attitude about pre Tesla and lower is where the implant is at, as you alluded to. Nowadays, every implant has a package insert that has its own functionality in it. And you look at that and
Yeah.
know if people in your scanner can't figure out if sickness is landing down our conditional guidelines, you shouldn't do implants.
No, so the point
But
that
if you can, I mean, just look at the
no, the problem. So the thing is, we can in many patients we can get the what implant they've had. That's what we need to find out. But there's a degree of work to get that. And actually, on a clinical scan, what they'll say is, do you have an implant? Yes, I've got a hip implant. fine, you can have a scanner. Nobody's having to find out what that implant was. And if you're saying that anything outside the head, if it was, as long as it was put in more than 6 months ago, is safe to scan, why do I need to go through that hoop of finding out what that implant was if I know it's safe to scan? They're all essentially.
Yeah, we don't
it-
do that.
Well, 70 as well.
So for, I mean, I think that we know what the implant is, and we always go to MRI.com.
Yeah, but do we need to? No, but there's many centres that don't ask. So I know that there's, for example, at Cambridge, they're in the UK, they don't ask. They're just
Yeah,
scanning.
we don't ask.
At 70.
No,
You don't ask them what the details of the implant is. That's what you're saying. It's not that you don't ask if there's an
no, we don't have to do that. Right. So
Yeah.
if someone has a hip implant at 3T, everything that I'm read, as long as it's getting in the bone, 6 months old,
and you're not.
and we're not
Yeah.
scanning.
It's not in the field.
Of
We're
course.
not in the field of view. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
We're scanning, we're not doing totally different if we were doing
And that's largely true.
abdominal.
But there's
Why
other-
are you
there's-
saying largely true?
Well,
Why is it that
Well, because there's
you
other
said
kinds
what?
of implants, like stents.
No. I
That
want
got
to know
moved
what
on.
it is. No, stent is a whole different thing. But if it's a hip, if you're just talking a hip, for example, why do I need to know what?
We don't.
So you don't look, you don't find out. No,
Not really.
a stent, of course, I would want to find
Yeah,
out.
just
Yeah,
that's generally speaking, there's all kinds of implants, and
yeah,
nowadays, many of them are okay.
yeah.
Lower, some of them just have restrictions.
Okay,
This is super interesting. So
thank
we should
you.
talk
I
after.
think maybe
wanna-
I'll try and get your details
Yeah.
for my team.
I'm gonna say something here. So everyone hear
yeah.
me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So other things, so screening, this implant evaluation is a big thing. How do we do that? Because we don't have someone like you on site all the time. That's a problem for research sites. The other thing is research equipment and sequences. So how's safety evaluating research equipment? Oftentimes, if it's a commercial device, people are going to provide some kind of information. A big one of these, if I'm sitting here with you guys, S14s, who has S14 headphones?
What is an S4?
No, these are the Sensometrics S14 insert headphones. Oh, no, okay. Lots of things. Yeah. Yeah, it's the S15s, right, where they basically have zero restrictions. 14s, which were in wide use, had SAR restrictions. SAR restrictions would actually be in a lot of our scans, like Spineco, field maps, or even just normal field maps. And lots of people scan them, even though they signed away their life to Sensometrics and bought them. So that's something. And then there's also the issue, of course, of devices that are made in-house. How is that evaluated? And then the sequences. So if you read the fine print on a lot of Siemens CTPs, and sometimes CTPs you get, you'll get a CTP and it might not be compiled. And basically the liability risk or whatever of compiling that sequence, we have, for example, from the UK, the multi-parameter analysis. And they don't provide them compiled. Your ICE expert is supposed to evaluate the safety at your site of their service. So yeah, those are challenges we kind of face in research that it's a little unclear what to do with that. High-risk participants is another one. So this was interesting, I thought, because in the ISMRM guidelines about MR operators that are not MRI technologists or radiographers, they basically carve out an exception and say, well, if your participants are higher risk, then maybe this is not the best idea to have a trained grad student run them, and maybe that should be with a MRI technologist. But again, that varies widely site to site. So that's something that's interesting, like in my site at least, we think about that, and then it comes down to also the questions that come up is whose responsibility are those procedures? Is the responsibility of, if you have a special population, blind individuals, or anxiety, or infants, or kids? Is it the center? Is it the researcher? Because at the end of the day, if you're doing research, it's the IRB of the researcher, and oftentimes the researcher, that's where the buck's going to stop with them. Or is it a collaboration between? Clothing and comfort is a big one, and this is different than clinical. You talk to clinical technologists, whether they're in scrubs, no way, no how, and they will die on that hill. Whereas in research, it varies quite a bit. At my center, we try to do very thorough screening. We have a clothing policy and a metal detector. Again, because laundry services are a pain, that's the least But moreover, it's a comfort issue and potentially a kind of IRB issue with certain populations that changing clothes, taking off your bra, doing that kind of thing makes a difference when it's a research participant versus a patient.
Do you distinguish between 3T and 7T?
I don't have a 7T, so
yeah.
everything I'm talking about is
So for us at 3T, people are just wearing their own clothes, and we check pockets.
At 7T,
but
I would have
7T,
different,
they
Yep,
change it.
exactly. But lots of sites that are 3T are also sclerosis. So again, that's
Okay.
a thing. Non-standardizing. I don't think necessarily that anything that a group or a doctor should be prescriptive. Again, it should be kind of pure with data or information. Potentially you can make your again, participant privacy is a big thing. So de-identification and scans. This is kind of less safety, but I kind of put it under the umbrella. How is identifying information recorded in DICOM headers when students are entering the scanner? What's the record keeping? What happens to that safety screening form? This is sometimes up to the IRB, sometimes not. So at my center, we have a safety form. It goes into a safe by the MRI operator. I review them weekly to see if there's anything weird or interesting in there, then I shut it. But other institutions might have it and needs to be also comfort in the MR environment, screening, all that kind of thing. That's a difference we have in research. We're really interested in that. Because it gives us better data when that's the case. Whereas I've had a couple clinical MRIs. They do not care. It depends on where you're at and how good the facility is. But pretty common that we're just putting there without even putting the mirror on, staring at the top of the board in the first level scanning mode. That's the way it is on a clinical scan. We, doing research, are not going to do that. Then facility design procedures. This is another thing. There's not a lot of guidance. I've been involved now with design and construction of a couple different facilities, and things like access control. I've been to research sites where even a suite was kind of designed for MRI, and you will walk in the front door of that suite, and there's no physical barrier between room 2 and room 3. Except a very crappy metal detector. Wow, that doesn't seems like this is a very solid problem. There could be guidance that if someone is going to build a research MRI, at least that they could be pointed in the right direction. The problem is oftentimes, speaking from experience, luckily I was involved in the sector I've run up and I scrutinized the plans, but if you talk to people like me who run centers, they are often hired after that facility is basically done, magnets there and ramps. Oh yeah, we need someone to run this place, so you hire that person. And that person oftentimes has the expertise to tell them you should have a 2 and 3, and that doesn't happen. That's yeah, those are the quick run-throughs that I have. These are the last couple things. We'll open it up. So, there's a lot of good stuff that's already come up here. I'm interested in what you think that I've been wanting to come to this might be the best way to share information, maybe to create standards. Online resources, wiki, read the docs, who manages it, how does that work, or forum, something like Neurostar. There is no equivalent research forum. I know a lot of research techs and researchers actually are on the Facebook group for MRI safety, but that again is very clinically focused. Oftentimes when research questions are asked, all the answers you get are from clinical texts. They're not wrong necessarily, but they are just a very different viewpoint and don't take into consideration say that we have to deal with the research that aren't clinicians. And then vice versa. Clinical texts are good, all kinds of stuff is good. And then finally, is there interest or would it be valuable to take it another step, try to do an OHBM best practices document or wiki or forum? And again, the challenges there are different countries, regulations, practices, how do you deal with that? Or just maybe just starting to put this information in place would be enough to be helpful to
So there are already publications on a lot of things
Yeah.
that we're talking about. And you should point out some of them right now. Don't go into a lot of detail. And part of the reason is because it's hard to go into a lot of detail. Generally, my suggestion for somebody setting up a standalone research center that doesn't have a physician or radiologist
So this is actually, well, exactly what you just said is what we need, at least in my experience, and I'm not going to know what you have, but I've definitely been emailed and called to talk to people designing open facilities. Everything you just said, they're totally right? Because they didn't come from that place like CMR.
They're totally unaware of it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Well,
they're.
They should be doing it. It's crazy.
I-
So
this is my point. Right? And that,
Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree. But I think that maybe people here have been in some of these facilities where obviously some of these things are thought about and or are in place and they're scanning away. And that doesn't necessarily seem like a good thing. Why do we need to, probably there's not a paper, again, maybe you and me, this is kind of automatic, but I don't know if anyone's ever written it up, what it should actually look like, published it, and or put it in a place that someone opening a new MRI facility who's basically a cognitive neuroscientist has a background. They're a big wig because they're a big memory person. Some university says, we're going to give you $20 million to build this place. Come do it. I'm like, okie dokie, that sounds great. And they do it, and they let the architects design the facility who don't know anything about it. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. The fringe field is done.
did you say it's a plastic sheet?
Don't go beyond this because you're doing the ghost line. How is this a thing? You have the warning sign on the outside of the building. Yeah. Yeah, that seems like.
We have for us to open top.
Right. I mean, but I think this is
The
part
thing,
of.
the thing that people don't think about are fringe fields.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So there's a lot of fringe fields going up through that roof that when they come out, facilities that walk around.
Totally. Absolutely. And in a lot of buildings, again, lots of MRI centers and psychology departments are shut down vacant. And you have to trust, you have to shooting contractors that have to do calculations and know that you know the shield ceiling.
So the newer generation of that,
Yeah.
a lot of the shape of the straight field is actually larger because they try to pitch it in and assume that the apron goes down.
Yeah. Yeah. Building scanners on alleys work perfectly.
Thank you.
So, yeah, almost fine. This actually turned out really well, so thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
How do you communicate with people with hearing loss during the scan?
Oh, so if you have a mirror, you can effectively use a button box and train the participant ahead of time by yes, no. And then you can use the computer and the mirror to type out questions.
Oh, on the screen
that
so they can see it.
Oh, yeah,
That's
yeah.
clever.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it'll
yeah.
actually voice
Totally right. A little benefit. Yeah. That's really good. I mean, we had the same thing, we scan blind.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, thank you. That's of thoughts about, forum best practices, what will be most helpful, just in getting things in a place, getting references that are out there in a place, I don't know.
Germany is kind of known for being very formal about things.
Yeah.
We have our what's that, the Linux model, which everything like we have a 20-page document about safety with all the guidelines which have to be built, which are no way of research. And if we don't have a nice formally written document, it gets thrown in the trash anyway because it's not being accepted. So even if you have need a proof that 100 MRI physicists say this is safe, then the company will still like, okay, and we have a nice formal sample of it, formal, and that is accurate.
No. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Als je afhankelijk is, als je schrijft een screening voor
So, the screening form?
Yeah, the screening form.
Oh, sure, my screening form?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd be happy, sure.
No, that's not because you shred it.
Oh, shred it, oh, yeah.
Okay, because so in EU, GDPR, because 10 years, so we're not allowed to keep it. So we're not allowed to. Why do you shred it?
I don't want to retain the information about past surgery for.
So the thing that happens, several weeks later,
Yeah.
something will come up. So we actually keep treating
Mhm. Yeah.
because several weeks later it'll say, oh, I forgot that I had an
Right.
So
So,
if you don't have that screen form, you're not off the hook.
so the question, this is a very good question, it's like, who is not on? And that's again where different institutions. So, I, as the center, shred the form. But it is up to the researchers, PI and IRB, that's who this one would go to if they have an issue with this. Is the PI investigator.
Okay.
But then they
So
need the
they
form.
actually, and it's up to
Do
them.
they have a copy of that form?
If they want it, they have it.
Mm.
And that's their responsibility. So, and again, this is a big topic, like where does the responsibility of the center?
As long as you're full disclosure to PI,
Yeah, that's my opinion, that's kind of the
you should keep that screen form because it
exactly.
goes back to
And,
you.
and
Yeah.
the other thing is that the PI, they already have all the information, because we essentially require, at least my center, that they're proofing.
Yeah.
When they come and do this form,
Yeah.
that's all already been all collected. And the PI has that in the method that the IRB is approved. So, and that pre-screening method is approved by the IRB, and they have that information. But
And it's just a perfect way that the screen form is actually reviewed by the person.
Exactly. it could go.
Of course, I see your point, but from your perspective, you don't want to keep saying that. I mean, if the PI wants a copy, they can get a copy of it on the day. And also the aspect of everyone's pre-screening, so they should have a record of their pre-screening. I think we all know things pop up on the day, I did have a surgery.
Yeah.
So I feel like, yeah, those things happen all the time. So, yeah, I guess I would probably want to encourage anyone on is like, we have a similar issue. We have our research groups, they all retain their own. So that's how we get around, our staff, our platform staff, Ray Governor University signs it. So it says, we did that check on the day, and we did it. Our research also signs it. So we know that the research team, someone on there with their actual sign it. So we have it during the scan, and once the scan is over, and they keep it, because they are the ones who are going to get that call.
Yeah, and that's, so that's an interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, because I guess my concern with your model is just the one that was done months ago isn't necessarily the same as the one that was done on the day.
I mean, absolutely, yeah. And usually in my center, again, because I have not technologists, I have operators, pretty much if someone shows up and their surgery has not been previously documented, pretty good. Because and this is again an issue of research. I think I've trained those folks well, but I do not want to put the burden on their graduate students. When they show up to say like, oh, I got a hip implant. You can tell us what a hip implant for, and at this point, I hear about all implants because I've
they show up and they say that, it's like, "Good. We'll review, and it shows up. Any policy thing?
Because I have texted Steve, but I also have
What do you do about paying for the scan? My 7T scans are about £1,000 each. So if that comes up on the day, are they charged for that scan, or do you defer it and push it over to the next?
That varies wildly by center. So my center, in the interest of A, safety, because I don't want people to try to stick stuff behind me, we have a no fault. That is
That
center
is
to center.
also, well, that's also worth knowing, because I'm being charged if a patient says, oh, I forgot I had a cesarean section, which has happened,
Yeah.
actually. How you can forget that? I've
Yeah.
been charged for that scan.
And I would say in my,
You're getting that, aren't you? Yeah.
Well, what I do is like him, I'm fairly lenient,
Yeah.
but a particular study gets kind of chronic.
Yeah.
Say, from now on,
Yeah.
charge.
No, I've got a very good
yeah,
team.
and that's
so
like,
we're-
I don't know, where you even, I couldn't look for that. So we use Calpendo, which.
yeah, we've just started using that.
And I can generate a form in Calpendo about the cancellation and or for what reason
Yeah.
each group. And if they basically start being naughty,
Yeah. Actually, they have just introduced a 5%. We're allowed 5% failure.
Do you provide evidence that you screen this individual properly prior to scheduling?
We do. No, we actually screen them like twice, because we do a screening call, and then when we call like the week before, we check everything again. My team are very well
Right, but
trained
again,
to
If you
check.
provide that, they still charge, even if you've shown you.
They have been. It might.
People want to have policy on the reason that
Yeah.
I mean, you schedule a slot and
Yeah.
you cancel it 2 minutes beforehand at 9 or something.
Yeah.
Whether it's because of the screen or something.
Yeah.
Still, as the person,
Exactly.
researcher, that's the only time. And so, as a person who's running the scanner, scanners, I just lost an hour, right?
Yeah, that's their argument. But helpful to know that.
Super lenient then, since we basically have the policy if you can't use the data, you will be in charge. So even if the participant halfway in says, no, I don't know, no problem, no charge. And of course it's different because we technically don't own our own scanners, because we have hospital properties, and we only charge like only 100.
150. Oh my.
that's a big, so, I have to be really. So we, so my understanding is clinically, they do not, especially for brain. If they're doing abdominal or something like that. But if they're doing a brain scan, they'll scan. We would only scan the only hormonal, all plastic ones for a long time. Then we've dug into the newer ones with copper rings, so the Loretta, sorry, the two other ones that are made by Mayer, which are hormonal but have the copper, sorry, the silver ring. And at least in talking to radiologists, it's like, we're never going to get to the SAR restriction for that. So we will now scan those. We still won't scan Paragard, but I don't know.
We define a disclaimer, we put in our screen form a disclaimer that if even the approved ones, that it is possible that they move, and that the function might be impaired, we advise the gynecologist really,
I mean, it shouldn't move.
they shouldn't,
Well,
but
the plastic ones shouldn't move. The ones that have the silver ring, but I think, I mean, that's like when we looked at the torque.
yeah, but
They're
that's
so
really
small.
a safety thing. I think it's kind of
Oh, no, we don't do that.
bad policy because we think you can accept responsibility. So we do have a list of safe ones, but even so we have a list of some which we don't scan, but even the ones which we do scan, we kind of defer responsibility because we advise the participant.
Yeah, I mean, we started scanning the silver ones because it's sending community to home, right? Awesome, great, whatever, but you don't want to exclude things we don't.
What are you
doing?
doing?
So, I mean, just basically, like I was saying before, we basically follow the right? So we scan, at 3G, we scan basically all of them. At 17,
Okay.
so the last one was just,
don't know what it is, even you know it's a hybrid, like,
Yeah.
or any, yeah. So I think that's the issue. We have it when you can't really track that record, or it takes too long, or the clinician doesn't really want to give you the information somehow. Then we were like looking for whether any sort of blanket will tell us this is fine to go ahead. But I mean, people who we don't, because we are like a small center, and then people sit in the safety committee who say, oh, we can't take that responsibility to approve this because I don't know what it is. Even we have someone who is like giving the advice, as the radiologist said, yeah, it should be fine, but they are not the one who's going to take responsibility if something happens. That's why our committee still can't approve. So I don't know how this, unless there's a like official guideline telling us.
And I don't think there's a one answer fits all. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I absolutely see both sides of it, but really, it's going to be the liability
Yeah.
of different by countries, like, and even institutions, and at my center at least, for more complicated, like we have a study which has cognitive impairment and they're older, right? So then you're trusting medical records and whatever to try to figure that out.
Yeah.
And we decided that there's an attending neurologist who's basically they're his patients.
Yeah, they're my patients.
And he
This is
signs
it. Yeah.
he signs off, and like, okay, you're taking also they're clinical as well, so we're okay with that. But if it was just
Can I
a random
email you?
PI,
Is that all right? Can I drop you a line?
Yeah,
Do you
just-
mind?
but just, you were like, I'm not gonna do any kind of blessing.
No, I don't want a blessing. No, I'd like to know what you do.
What I will do is tell you, he can do the calculation. So
Yeah.
that there's not any restrictions. I'm just arguing.
Surgical clips and hips and knees where you don't know the implants. But it sounds like even at 70,
At 17, you need to know what the material is. I always want to know if it's 17. If it's a really old implant, and I don't know what it is, I'm not.
oh, at 70 you wouldn't be okay with a hip or knee. Well, no, hips and knees are not going to be from the 90s. No, they're going to be what is. No, they're not.
I think we might also have to jump that if we don't know what it is, we assume it's fine. We don't use that, but there's any safety like we have to assume that if we don't know, it's
No, but it sounds like for clips it doesn't matter. And then for a hip or knee implant that's from the last 20 years, it's not going to be us. Nobody's doing it.
I mean, it's good
So
documentation, a couple of books.
But as long as it's not near, like shoulders are a problem.
Yeah.
So we're actually publishing paper on shoulder implants.
Okay. Okay.
But any sort of hardware.
Yeah. I'd like to see the shoulder paper will be useful, but actually there's much fewer of those. For me, it's hips and
Yeah,
knees.
but it's,
that I'm-
but,
yeah.
as long as you know that the material, I don't know. And like you say, in the last 20 years, it's likely going to be high quality stainless steel or titanium.
Yeah.
I have to go.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just want to say, I think that it would be it is a good idea to actually, maybe as a collection of existing persons
Yeah.
that have been published out there, and maybe have some kind of follow-up as to, there is some missing knowledge out there. Because it is a little bit difficult to chase down all these.
Yeah, and that seems to be the problem. Again, big shot people go open a center.
I know, so
They don't know what they got.
So the IMR safety committee has several people that I know. That I could ask her to send me some stuff. And I could send it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much for coming.
But it won't be complete. But I could at least get the stuff that she.
No, I mean just starting to do this. And are you a physicist by training, or are you?
I am.
Okay. So yeah, this is again what I fucking residents. So it's great to have. So thank you for coming. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, please send me an email so I know who's here. Actually, yeah, give me an email. Sorry.
I think it's a bit sad we are only a dozen.
Yeah, this is what I expected. I was actually kind of happy to throw this many. I thought it might be like 8. So. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
certain things.
Where are you at? Oh, it happened. Okay, cool.
By the
Excellent.
psychiatry,
Thank you.
one is by the and they are the professor getting the whole.
Sorry, the what?
Do you make people enjoy?
No, we don't.